Okay, former President Donald Trump speaking in Asheville, North Carolina, speaking about the speech was billed, rather, to be a speech about his economic policies. And while we've gotten a little bit of that, it's also just your classic rally speech where he's gone on the attack against Vice President Harris, et cetera, et cetera. I want to turn to Alex Prochet, who is inside that room now. And Elizabeth Schulze joins us, too. We will go to Elizabeth momentarily. Alex, I want to start with you because prior to this rally yesterday, Nikki Haley, one of Trump's former opponents, she goes on Fox News and she says to Trump to stop, quote unquote, whining. She says Republicans are not going to win this election, talking about Kamala Harris's race, talking about whether or not she's, quote unquote, dumb. And Trump seems to have not taken that advice. He called her crazy in this rally. He said that she's, quote, not smart. She's not intelligent. He is going after her on her personality, on personal attacks, not on policy, it would seem.
Yeah, Jay, you're right. And really, it's been 50-50 with the personal attacks versus, the personal attacks and the attacks on the process, and then rolling out, what he's basically framed as failed policies of the Biden-Harris administration. And so whenever Haley was talking about this yesterday and saying that he needed to focus on the issues, that's where he's able to bring people under the tent towards the middle. Listen, that's where there's ground to gain in this election. It's not on the far left. It's not on the far right. It's those moderates towards the middle. And so these personal attacks, whenever he's going after her intelligence, whenever he's going after the process about how there was a change at the top of the Democratic ticket, when he's talking about crowd sizes, that's all distractions. And it might resonate with certain sections of this crowd, but in the broad goal of trying to woo that middle ground voter, that moderate, that's something that doesn't really move the needle. And so thus far, he's still speaking, but thus far, it's been about 50-50 this entire speech between the personal attacks and the policy talk.
Right, and that was a point that Haley made in that Fox interview, saying that this is an election not just for Trump's MAGA base, which will always vote for Trump and which will turn out for Trump, but he's got to make inroads with suburban women, undecided voters, particularly in those battleground states, and attacking Kamala Harris, in Nikki Haley's view, would not serve that purpose. I want to go back to you, Alex, in a second, but I want to bring in Elizabeth Schulze, who covers all things politics, but also all things the economy for us. Elizabeth, as I was listening to Trump there, again, this is a speech that was ostensibly billed as his pitch of his economic policies. And there were two things I took out of it policy-wise. One was no tax on tips, which he mentioned in a passing way. It's also written on the stage behind him. And another thing he said, I'll quote him directly. He said, if Trump were to be elected, quote, young people will be able to afford a home. Savings will soar. Inflation will go down. But then he didn't finish that sentence and say how he would do that. Have you heard any policy prescriptions so far?
For those of us hoping for some explicit policy details, Jay, this was definitely a disappointment, at least so far, because when both former President Trump and Vice President Harris talk a lot about bringing down costs, but we want to see exactly what that's going to take. And the fact is, when you look at the data today, and we have fresh inflation data that really gives a picture of where prices are in the economy. The inflation rate today is at 2.9% annual inflation. That is the lowest level in more than 3 years. Inflation did peak at 9% under Joe Biden, as former President Trump made clear it was high under President Biden. That is not the highest it's ever been. That was a false claim from former President Trump. We had seen almost double that rate a couple of decades ago. The other clear point that former President Trump made here that was just frankly false, Jay, was on unemployment. He talked about when he left office, when former President Trump left office, he said the economy was in a much stronger position than it is now with the jobs market. The unemployment rate when Trump left office was 6.4%. Today, we're looking at a 4.3% unemployment rate. That's a lot lower. What that means that today, there are broadly more people who are able to get a job than there were at that time. So this was an example where former President Trump was picking and choosing some of the data points that he wanted from his administration. I think it's also really important to keep in mind, if you even want to go back exactly 4 years ago, a much worse economy. We were still in the throes of the pandemic then. So a lot of the economic record that former President Trump is choosing to tout here, he's picking those facts. A lot of them are not reality compared to the picture that we're looking at today.
And speaking of the picture we're looking at, I think he's making an inflation or a shrinkflation point. He's holding up a box of Tic Tacs while you were speaking there, Elizabeth. I don't know what he was saying, so we're just going to let that go. But I do want to go on to one other piece of what he talked about in terms of the economy, which is he seemed to start a line of attack on Harris that we're likely to hear him repeat, which is he said there are things that Harris wants to do economically on day one. And what Trump said is, quote, day one for Kamala was 3.5 years ago, essentially trying to tie her to the Biden administration. And I know you fact-checked this a little bit, but give us an understanding of the economic picture under this administration. Because what he's essentially said to this crowd is, I'm going to go back to how it was 4 years ago. Are you better off now, to this crowd, than you were 4 years ago? Economically, where are we as a country? Fact-check that for me.
Well, and this is something we're going to look at so closely is how much does Kamala Harris take on the same perception of the economy that Joe Biden has? Because the fact is, the economy, especially inflation, has been a liability for this administration. Prices, the former president is correct that inflation overall is up 19.4%. I did the math right before this, Jay, since Joe Biden took office. So that means that the level of prices that you pay are still a lot higher today than they were 4 years ago. And that is something that we have heard when you go out and talk to voters, when you talk to households, and even when you talk to companies, that is something that they feel, especially when you look at, say, grocery prices. They're up 21%. Restaurant prices also up. Rent, another big culprit, up about 22% in that time. So even though we have seen this easing in costs, they're not going up as fast, the overall level is still higher than it was. And that's something we are undoubtedly going to try to hear the former president still continue to say. The counter argument that we are now hearing emerge, at least from the Biden administration, is yes, but at the same time, wages have gone up. And so I do just want to put this in context for you. When you look at the numbers, just think about a dollar amount. Inflation, the typical household spending $900 more, $905 exactly, according to Moody's Analytics, for the same goods and services as they were 3 years ago because of inflation. So if you buy all the same stuff every single month that you were 3 years ago, it's going to cost you $900 more every month. But for the typical household, the average income is up $1,073 during that time. So what that does mean is that you can't really just look at prices in a vacuum like that. If your wages and your salary is also going up, that does help offset some of those higher prices.
Elizabeth Schulze, thank God we have you to do the math for us, because I got into television journalism not to do math. Alex, very quickly to you, before we let everyone go here. We have seen Trump also talk about President Biden. He said that Biden was, quote unquote, usurped. He talked about the Democrats that pushed Biden off the ballot because they didn't think he'd have a good chance of beating Trump in November. It seems like every time Trump brings up Biden, he also talked about the money that he spent on Biden already in this campaign, Trump did just moments ago. It seems like every time he talks about Biden, he seems to be hearkening back for the way this race was just a few weeks ago.
Well, and this also kind of underscores, again, what Nikki Haley was talking about yesterday, right? I mean, he talked earlier today about spending $100 million against a candidate he's no longer running against, and the frustration that's attached to that. He also talked about Biden being angry. He characterized him as angry about him being basically forced out of not being able to run for a second term. I should note that the president has full-throatedly endorsed his vice president in this race, and there's no evidence of this, but this is a narrative that that Trump has now shifted to, and in trying to highlight that this has been an unfair process. But again, it doesn't necessarily move the needle on bringing people under the tent from the middle. Certainly, with his staunch supporters, that resonates with them, and that's something that's going to draw applause. But whenever it comes to getting those voters towards the center, I don't know that that's something that really resonates with that crowd.
Okay, Trump's still on the stage. We will continue to monitor his remarks. Alex Perche, Elizabeth Schulze, thank you very much.